The station had no name in any human language. It existed in galactic administrative records as Waypoint Threshold 7 Kareth, a designation that translated roughly to the place where species are evaluated before being permitted further, which was either bureaucratically efficient or philosophically chilling depending on your perspective. Sergeant Mira Voss had stopped deciding which after the third week. She was the only human stationed there. This was not unusual by the standards of the Convergence Authority, the multi-species governing body that had absorbed humanity into its administrative framework 14 months ago, with the warmth and enthusiasm typically reserved for filing paperwork. Humans were new, humans were probationary. Humans were, in the unspoken calculus of the Convergence, a species that had demonstrated sufficient technological threshold to warrant inclusion but insufficient cultural legibility to warrant trust. One human at each observation post. That was the policy. Not enough to constitute a threat, enough to study. Mira understood this. She had been briefed on it by the integration liaison, a tall cephalopod-adjacent being named Orith Kov, who had explained the policy with the particular patience of someone who fully expected not to be understood. She had nodded. She had signed the forms. She had boarded the transport to Waypoint Threshold 7 Kareth and spent the first week learning the layout, the second week learning the hierarchy, and the third week learning that the hierarchy and the third week learning that the hierarchy existed primarily to ensure she remained legible, observable, and functionally irrelevant. Her role was titled Biological Welfare Auxiliary, Class Provisional. What this meant, in practice, was that she worked in the station's containment and rehabilitation sector, the part of the facility where species in transit were held, catalogued, medically assessed, and prepared for onward movement. It was, she had come to understand, the galactic equivalent of a very large airport with very complicated customs and a medical clinic attached. The beings who moved through the station were extraordinary by any measure she had grown up with. She had catalogued species that communicated through pressure variations in their exoskeletons, species that existed in 3 simultaneous biological states and had to be addressed in grammatical tenses that English did not contain, species that regarded the concept of individual identity as a quaint and somewhat embarrassing evolutionary artifact. She had learned to move carefully, to speak less, to observe more, and to accept that she was, in the eyes of almost everyone here, a curiosity at best. Orith Kov managed the rehabilitation sector directly. He was methodical and precise and deeply committed to Convergence protocol in the way that suggested protocol was not merely a professional standard but a moral one. He had explained to Mira during her orientation that the Kareth Van were the apex predator caste of a species from the Saithral system, bipedal and heavily muscled, and possessed of a sensory range that made them acutely responsive to intent, to fear, to aggression, the emotional weather of a room as much as its physical content. They were, he had said, a convergence partner species of the highest classification. Their pups, the young, were carried through transit routes twice a standard cycle for population management reasons she had not been cleared to understand. They required careful handling. She had noted all of this. She had not anticipated that it would matter in the particular way it eventually did. The pup arrived on a transport that had experienced a navigational correction 17 hours longer than scheduled. This was not unusual. What was unusual was that the correction had involved a pressure event in the cargo corridor where the juvenile Kareth man had been housed, and the pup, which was approximately 40 kilograms of dense muscle, articulated claws, and neurologically heightened threat response, had been thrown against the housing structure hard enough to fracture 2 of the load-bearing bones in its right hind limb. It arrived in the rehabilitation sector in a state that Mira recognized immediately and that the Convergence medical records described clinically as acute physiological distress with elevated defensive response potential. What this meant was that the pup was in pain, was frightened, and was responding to both by attempting, with considerable sincerity, to destroy anything that came close to it. The Convergence rehabilitation team, which consisted of Orith Kav and 2 medical technicians of a species called the Velsheri, who communicated primarily through color shifts in their translucent skin, had assessed the situation from beyond the containment barrier and determined that immediate intervention was inadvisable. The pup's pain response was spiking its threat detection system. Its cortisol-equivalent hormones, what the records called threat saturation markers, were at a level that meant any approach would be read as predatory. Attempting to medicate it, to treat it, to move it, would require sedation. Sedation from a distance required a chemical delivery system that would not be misread as an attack. Preparing that system would take 8 hours minimum. In the meantime, the pup's fracture was worsening with every movement it made as it threw itself against the walls of the containment space. Orith had documented all of this in precise administrative language and flagged it for a medical oversight review that would convene in the morning. The protocol was clear. You did not enter a space with a distressed juvenile Karithmon. The species' defensive response was not metaphorical. The claws were not decorative. The solution was patience and preparation, and the correct chemical compound delivered at the correct distance. Mira had read the protocol. She had also watched the pup for 11 minutes through the containment barrier while Orith filed his documentation. The pup was small by Karithphane adult standards, which meant it was approximately the size of a large wolf, with the structural density of something considerably heavier. It moved in the way that injured things move when they cannot process why the pain is not stopping, which is to say it moved constantly, compulsively, each movement making the fracture worse, each worsening of the fracture driving another surge of distress that produced more movement. It was a physiological loop that would, if uninterrupted, cause a secondary injury or a cardiac event before morning. She understood that this was not her area of authority. She understood that Orith had a protocol and that the protocol existed for reasons and that the reasons were probably sound. She also understood, with the particular clarity that comes from watching something suffer, that by morning would be too late. She told Orith she was going to check the environmental calibration on the containment sector's interior systems, which required a brief entry. She said this calmly. Orith looked at her with the expression she had learned to read as something between professional confusion and species-appropriate concern. The look he gave her whenever she said something that did not fit within the expected parameter range of biological welfare auxiliary, class provisional. He told her he strongly advised against it. He told her the pup's threat saturation markers were at a level that made interior entry categorically inadvisable. He told her the protocol existed precisely for situations like this one. She said she understood. She picked up a medkit and the thermal sheet from the equipment locker, neither of which had anything to do with environmental calibration, and walked to the containment entry. What Orith did not know, and what Mira had not offered as information, was that she had grown up in a rural region of northern Sweden, where the interaction between humans and large frightened animals was not a theoretical consideration, but a practical one. Her grandmother had kept horses and had a philosophy about them that had been transmitted to Mira, not as formal instruction, but as the kind of knowledge that passes between people through demonstration, through quiet example, through the accumulated grammar of 100 small moments. The philosophy was not complicated. It was, an animal in pain that cannot escape will destroy itself trying. Your presence is either a threat or an anchor. There is no neutral option. Choose which one you intend to be and commit to it completely. She entered the containment space. The pup's response was immediate and violent and precisely what Orith documentation had predicted. It pivoted toward her with the whole ferocity of its distress, its claws scoring the floor plates, a sound coming from it that was not quite a roar and not quite a scream, but existed in the frequency range where both overlap, which is the frequency range where the nervous system stops asking questions and starts running. Mira did not run. She stopped. She lowered herself to the floor, not quickly, not with any sharp motion, simply descended to sitting with the deliberateness of someone choosing to be small, choosing to occupy less space, choosing to be, as completely as her body could communicate it, not a threat. The pup froze. This was not what it had learned to expect. Threat saturation at its current level had a well-documented response profile among Karithmon. Approach meant attack. Attack meant escalation. Escalation meant the encounter resolved one way or another in a matter of seconds. What the pup's neurology had no framework for was something that approached and then stopped and then became still and stayed. Mira stayed. She did not speak. She did not reach for it. She sat on the cold floor of the containment space with her back not quite to the wall, close enough that she was clearly not positioned to flee, and she breathed slowly, with the conscious deliberateness that her grandmother had called giving your body something honest to do, because animals read the breath before they read anything else. The pup made the sound again, lower this time, less certain. It took one step toward her, its injured hind limb dragging in a way that told her the fracture was bad, and then it stopped. It was reading her. She understood this. The Karathmon's sensory range included barometric, thermal, and what the technical documentation called biosignal resonance, which translated to something close to emotional legibility. It was reading her fear, which was present. She was not going to pretend otherwise. She was sitting on the floor of a room with an injured apex predator, and her heart was doing things hearts do in such situations. But fear is not the same as aggression, and the pup, somewhere beneath its pain, was calibrated to know the difference. She was afraid. She was not hunting it. She was not fleeing it. She was not fleeing it. She was simply there. Orith Cobb was watching through the observation feed. He had summoned the 2 Velshari technicians. All 3 of them were watching a human female sitting on the floor of a containment space with a distressed juvenile Karathmon, doing nothing, which was so outside the predicted action profile for the situation that none of them had an administrative category for it. An hour passed. Mira sat. The pup circled the space twice, its injury visible in every movement, and then it stopped circling and stood approximately 4 meters from her, and they existed in the same room together, 2 creatures in pain of different kinds, one of them choosing to stay inside the pain without reacting to it, which is the most precise definition of courage that Mira had ever arrived at through personal experience. At some point between the first hour and the second, the pup lowered itself to the floor. Not near her. Not yet. But it lowered itself, and this was the fracture in the pattern of the night. The first moment where its body chose rest over defense, because something in the room had finally stopped reading as a threat, long enough for exhaustion to say its piece. Mira waited. When the pup had been still for 20 minutes, she shifted her position, very slowly. A few degrees of orientation change, the way you recalibrate, without announcing that you are recalibrating. She moved the thermal sheet she had brought without ceremony, without directed attention, simply extended it a fraction of the way along the floor in the pup's direction. Not as an offering, not as a gesture, simply as a thing that existed in the space. The pup watched her do this. Its ears, the lateral sensory plates that flanked its skull, shifted. It watched the thermal sheet. It watched her. Nothing happened. 15 minutes later, without apparent decision, the pup had moved close enough that one foreleg was resting on the edge of the sheet. A further 30 minutes, and it had moved again. By the 3rd hour, it was lying with its injured hind limb extended, the warmth of the thermal sheet against the fracture site, and its head was down on the floor plates, not asleep, not unguarded, but resting in the way things rest when they have decided, provisionally and without committing to anything, that the immediate threat level does not require full activation. Mira did not touch it. She did not medicate it. She sat beside it, present and still and breathing, and she stayed that way through the 4th hour and the 5th, while Orith Kov and the Velshari technicians watched in silence through the observation feed. At approximately the 5th hour, something shifted. The pup made a sound that was different from any of the sounds it had made before. Quieter, lower, without the threat frequency that had characterized everything earlier. Mira recognized it not from any briefing document, but from the grammar of sound that frightened animals make when they move from the register of fighting to the register of enduring. It was the sound of something deciding to survive. She had been cold for 3 hours. The containment space was climate-controlled for the pup's biology, not hers, and her body had spent considerable metabolic effort remaining functional in those conditions, which was fine. She had been colder. She had spent a winter at 17 years old, lost on a mountainside in a storm that no one had adequately forecast, and had found her way down in the morning, and the experience had given her a very specific piece of information about the relationship between cold and time that most people never needed to know, which was that they are not enemies if you refuse to treat them as emergencies. By the 6th hour, the pup had shifted its position in its sleep, and its flank was against her leg. She had not moved toward it. It had moved toward her in increments too small to constitute decision, which is how most significant movements happen. Orith Cav, watching the feed, had stopped filing documentation. The Velshari technicians had stopped shifting color. All three of them were watching with the quality of attention that is not professional and not institutional, the kind that happens when something is occurring that has no procedural category and therefore demands a different kind of processing. The night continued. The pup slept in broken intervals, waking each time some internal signal spiked its nervous system back to alertness, and each time it woke, Mira was there, still, present, unalarmed, and each time the pup read this and returned to the broken sleep of injured things. She did not know exactly when it stopped being something she was choosing to do and became simply what was happening, the way long commitments eventually lose the quality of choice and become the quality of the person. When the morning cycle engaged and the sector light shifted, the medical team had everything prepared. The sedation compound, the distance delivery system, 8 hours of preparation represented in a cart of equipment positioned outside the containment entry. Orith Cav had the medical protocol open on his display. When he opened the containment entry, what he saw was Mira sitting on the floor with the juvenile Karath Mon asleep against her side, its injured limb extended, its breathing slow, its threat saturation markers now visible on his handheld diagnostic at a level that the documentation reserved for Karath Bon in the care of their bonded family unit. He stood in the entry and looked at this for a long moment. Mira looked up at him. She said quietly that she thought they could probably do the procedure now if they moved carefully and kept their energy calm, because it had decided she was safe, and it would extend that decision to people she brought with her, provisionally, if they were careful. She said this with the matter-of-fact clarity of someone reporting an observation, not making a claim. Orith Cav had lived 47 standard years and worked in biological welfare across 11 species classifications. He was not a being who was easily reduced to a condition without procedural response. He stood in the entry for 4 more seconds before his administrative training reasserted itself, and he began moving toward the preparation cart with the focused attention of someone who has understood something and is using action to metabolize it. The procedure was completed in the morning. The pup tolerated the sedation without a secondary stress event, which the Velshari medical technician later noted in her report as statistically improbable given the pre-procedural threat saturation record, and which she flagged for species interaction research with a notation she had to create a new category for because the existing categories did not have language for what she was describing. Mira was reassigned to medical observation duties for the pup's recovery period. Orith Cav filed this reassignment with the Convergence Administrative System using her existing classification and then stood for a moment looking at the field where he had typed her designation, Biological Welfare Auxiliary, Class Provisional, and did not change it, because he did not know what he would change it to, and because the form required a recognized category, and because what had happened the previous night was not, as far as he could determine, a category that existed. What he did do was submit a supplementary observation report to the Integration Liaison Office. The report was formal and precise and written in the measured language of Convergence bureaucratic convention. It documented the timeline of the incident, the physiological state of the juvenile, the predicted outcome of the standard protocol, and the actual outcome following what Orith Cav categorized after considerable deliberation as unauthorized biological welfare intervention, class undetermined. In the final section of the report, where the submitting officer was invited to include contextual assessment, Orith Cav wrote the following: The human did not attempt to control the juvenile. She did not attempt to calm it through any mechanism the species interaction framework would recognize as intervention. She did not flee. She did not advance. She remained present across a period of 6 standard hours in environmental conditions below her biological comfort threshold, in proximity to an animal capable of significant physical harm, demonstrating no observable strategy, no measurable goal orientation, no exit calculus that the systems available to this station can model. The pup survived the night in better physiological condition than the protocol would have predicted for the morning. I am unable to determine what the human was doing. I can only document that she did it, and that it worked, and that I do not have a framework for why. He submitted the report and sat with it for a moment after submission. The way you sit with something you have tried to categorize and have failed, and which you suspect will resist categorization indefinitely. The integration liaison received the report 4 days later. She read it twice. She was a species from the governance core worlds who had spent 30 years working in interspecies coordination and who had read, in that time, approximately 60,000 incident reports from approximately 300 observation waypoints across the convergence's monitored space. She had a thorough professional understanding of most documented species' behavioral ranges. She had a general framework for human behavior that she had assembled from the standard integration profile and from the surveillance data that all class provisional species generated during their observation period. The report from Waypoint Threshold 7 Karath did not fit the framework. What troubled her was not the outcome. Outcomes could be assessed, could be filed in the relevant column, could be integrated into the predictive model. What troubled her was the mechanism, or rather the absence of one. Every species intervention in biological welfare situations operated through recognizable mechanisms: chemical calming, acoustic signaling, territorial displacement, hierarchical dominance assertion. Every species either controlled the situation or fled it. The human had done neither. The human had simply remained in conditions that made remaining physically costly, with no mechanism visible to any sensor the station possessed and no observable rationale that could be captured in the standard behavioral taxonomy. She wrote a note to the Species Integration Research Division. It was a short note. It said, "Please flag human behavioral observation data for review across all waypoints. There is something in the operational profile that we are not measuring correctly. I do not believe we have identified the correct variables." She did not know exactly what she meant by this. She knew that she meant it. Back at Waypoint Threshold 7 Karath, in the recovery space where the Karath Von pup was healing under the careful attention of the Velshari medical technicians, Mira Voss completed her observation logs each morning and each evening with the thoroughness that Orith Cav had come to expect from her and that he had stopped finding unremarkable. She noted the pup's feeding, its limb mobility metrics, its threat saturation markers, which continued to decline at a rate that was, the medical documentation noted, faster than average for unsupported juvenile recovery, and which the Velshari attributed in their private communications to a factor they described as reduced isolation stress, a clinical term for what Mira would have called, if anyone had asked her, having company. She was not celebrated for what she had done. There was no formal recognition, no institutional acknowledgement, no upgraded classification. The convergence did not move quickly and did not reorder its understanding of things without considerable bureaucratic process, and the bureaucratic process that would eventually arrive at a revised understanding of human behavioral capacity was only just beginning its first document cycle in an office several hundred light years from where Mira was sitting, entering feeding data into a terminal, while the pup slept 3 meters away. What there was, instead of recognition, was Orith Cav standing in the doorway of the recovery space one afternoon and watching her work for a moment before he spoke. He told her in the precise and measured language that was his natural register that he had submitted the incident report and that he had found the supplementary assessment section difficult to complete. He told her that he had 47 years of practice at completing assessment sections and that the difficulty had been notable. He told her that he had reviewed the surveillance footage from the night 3 times and that each time he had watched it, he had arrived at the same inability to identify the mechanism by which she had achieved the outcome. He paused. He said that in the Convergence's experience of 47 registered species across its administered space, every species had a legible behavioral logic, an underlying operating system that could be modeled, predicted, accounted for. He said that in 47 years he had not encountered a situation that could not be categorized within that framework. He said he was not certain the framework was adequate. Mira looked up from her terminal. She looked at him for a moment in the way she had learned to look at things in this place, with the patience of someone who has stopped being surprised that patience is necessary. She said she wasn't sure the framework had been designed with the right things in mind. Orithkov considered this. He said carefully that the framework had been designed to model behavior that serves the actor's survival interest. That was, he said, the basis of all documented interspecies behavioral analysis. Mira looked back at the pup, asleep in its recovery space, its hind limbs straight, its breathing regular, its threat saturation markers at the lowest level recorded since its arrival. She said she supposed that depended on how you defined the actor. Orithkov did not have an immediate response to this. He stood in the doorway for a moment longer, and then he said, with the careful formality of a being who is not comfortable with the territory he is entering, but is entering it anyway, that he thought she might not be what the Convergence had expected. She said, without particular drama, without pride or performance, that she thought probably the Convergence would need some time with that. She was right. It would need considerable time. It would take the report, and the note, and the data review, and the resulting research flag, and the subsequent analysis, and the long, slow institutional machinery of an authority that had been doing things the same way for longer than human civilization had been literate, and it would take all of this and more before anything changed in any official capacity. But in the recovery space of waypoint threshold 7 Kareth, something had already changed that no report would fully capture, which was that a juvenile apex predator from the Scythril system, a creature whose entire neurological architecture was built around the assessment and response to threat, had decided, through a night of accumulated evidence, that the human was safe. Not harmless. Safe. The distinction matters enormously to any creature that is calibrated to know the difference, and the creature was not wrong.